Joining us now to continue our discussion of the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling this week on affirmative action, Bob Parks, a member of Project 21, a national network of black conservatives. Bob, good to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So tell me, what do you think about the ruling?
I agree with the ruling, as I've always looked at pieces of legislation when they come out and how however it's later translated. I look at the original intent. And the original intent of the University of Michigan Law School affirmative action case was not about, as we're led to believe today, with all the emotionalism behind what happened in the Supreme Court. The original intent of that affirmative action ruling was not to enrich and help black people get into colleges because of past discrimination, redressing slavery, and everything else. What it was about, as it turns out, and the judge in the first case was very harsh about the need for this lawsuit, because what it turned out, it was basically liberal professors wanted black kids to come into the school so they could enrich the educational experience of white students. Basically, black people were being used as study aids. For that reason, I couldn't agree with it. I know that there are some people who still believe that we need to have affirmative action in this country because we have never been able to get over this hump. But you know, there are so many black people who have succeeded, who have met the standards to be able to get into schools, and they have done really great with their lives.
But Bob, we don't know if in those instances, if race was not one of the factors that was considered. I mean, I will use myself, for example. I know that I am a product of affirmative action. Yes, I had the grades. Yes, I had this, that, and the other. But I also came from a group of people who didn't have an opportunity to go to University of Texas at Austin, which is where I went undergraduate. Are you going to tell me that you don't think those people, as well as yourself, that you haven't benefited from affirmative action?
Well, I think in most cases it's not just as simple as putting everybody in a blanket case. Because, for example, if you sent your resume to a prospective employer, like I did when I applied for Fox Broadcasting in Hollywood, they didn't see my picture. This was way before you could email things. Right. And so I was given a job based on my qualifications. And that's where I think a lot of people would like us to be. Sure, we can keep...
See, what you just said, that's where people would like us to be. I just don't think we're there. I do not think it did you show up to the interview, did they see your blackness? Or did they just hire you based on your resume? Because a lot of times if we get to, get in the door, we can sit down on the couch and wait to be called in, but the minute somebody sees we're black, oh, you didn't sound black on the phone. Oh, my goodness. Oh, this is, and then all of a sudden you are as qualified as you are, and the job goes to somebody else.
Well, who seems to have the most problem also with how you sound? We, within the black community, we can be denigrated for acting white, speaking
that's
white.
The truth,
there was a young boy in Chicago last year who was beaten to death on the street because he studied, because he was acting and sounding white. He was trying to achieve. And when we're looking at affirmative action, we're looking at why young black children are having trouble getting into these colleges and why there's a need for affirmative action. Why do we never look at the high schools?
Well, absolutely. That's where it starts.
We've seen over the years schools that will pass kids through because they know once they get to college, there are the remedial classes. Why do we have to spend billions of dollars with remedial classes in college to teach kids what they should have learned in high school?
I agree with you. The educational system in this country is definitely broken, and No Child Left Behind, Common Core standards, so far nothing has worked. I know we are still trying to address that issue, but here's a problem I have with this. Affirmative action always focuses on African Americans or Hispanics, but the problem I have is, well, I'm going to use George Bush for example. So George Bush, his daddy, his granddaddy, they all went to Yale, Harvard, whatever, and so he gets legacied in. I don't know what his grades were like. I understand he was a C student at Yale. Well, the C student at Yale wasn't able to go on to Harvard. If I were a C student at Yale, I don't know if I'd be able to go on to Harvard, but he got the opportunity because he was a white man from a privileged family. This is, in my estimation, affirmative action, or let's call it another name. Let's call it Gigi, whatever we want to call it. It's the same thing. It's just got a blue blazer on instead of a red blazer on. But it's akin to affirmative action.
Well,
The whole legacy issue
Sure.
or whatever. Entitlement is what I call it.
Well, I think there's also a fine line between legacy and entitlement and nepotism, because we've also seen, for example, in Hollywood, where we have generations of actors who move on because of who their father was and who their mother was.
That's primarily white actors.
Well, there's Will Smith and his kids.
Now, I'll say this. Will Smith and his wife create their own projects,
Sure.
help to finance their own projects, get additional financing for their projects, so it is their product that they own. And if they have their kid in a movie, well, that's one thing. They also have other people in the movie.
Sure.
But so it's a little bit different than, me looking at someone and who gets a job because their dad worked with somebody in the law firm, and their dad says, my kid's about to graduate from law school, and they don't have the grades, or they didn't go to a top 10 law school like I did, but they get in the door because of who their dad knows. Well, my dad didn't get to be a lawyer. Neither did my mom. So I don't have the same opportunity. Opportunity, diversity, that's what it's about.
Well, and again, I think it also comes down to a little bit of ideology as well. It seems that people on the left always tell black people what we can't do. That's what we're always being told. I mean, we are, as black people, we are supposed to be for affirmative action. There is no diversity in thought in our community.
Yes, there is. We have you. You think differently.
Well, but as a percentage of the guests, for example, on your program or on a lot of black programs, people like myself, I mean, I was looking at some of the tweets that came out against Clarence Thomas. Now, granted, Clarence Thomas, whether he was for affirmative action before he could take advantage of it, that's the whole thing. Another thing, but the amount of racism that would not be tolerated if it was directed at you or other black people in the media or prominent black people, but because he's a conservative, the things that he has been called, because he dares not think the way we are, quote unquote, supposed to. In 1964, Malcolm X gave a speech, and I have a little excerpt of that speech on my website, where he and I'm really paraphrasing this quickly for TV, but he basically said that when it comes to presidential elections, the white vote is evenly split. It's the black turnout that decides who is going to be the president of the United States. So the politician comes in, tells black people what we're going to do for you. And then once they get elected, what happens to that black agenda that put him over the top? It always goes in the drawer. And we never hear things that every 2 years, 4 years, 6 years are promised to black people. Black people want vouchers. And that's a campaign issue. We vote for it. And then when it comes time to implement, what do we get? Mend it, don't end it.
All right, let's get back to Clarence Thomas, because it is a bone of contention. Here's a man who, please don't tell me that he did not benefit from affirmative action to get into the top law schools and undergraduate universities he attended. In addition to that, he was placed as the head of the EEOC. Well, they didn't put a white person in that position, they put a black man in that position. He has benefited from affirmative action. When Thurgood Marshall retired from the Supreme Court, George Bush decided, no, let me put another black person there. There's some affirmative action there, and he gets the position, and all of a sudden it's like he forgets how important affirmative action was to get him where he was, and he seems to be so angry and vehement against giving other people who look like him the same opportunities, because life hasn't changed so much. Stop and frisk, racial profiling, all of these things disproportionately impact especially you, a black man.
Sure. Well, before we get to the Clarence Thomas, yes, the stop and frisk, a lot of these things that do impact us as black people. And are we ever going to try not to absolve ourselves of responsibility of this? I've said years ago, if let's just say for one day there was no crime in the black community, just for one day, and then that one day was extended to 2 days, and then a week, the police would have to go someplace else looking for the crime. They come back to the black community because there's crime there. I worked in South Central Los Angeles while I was during my experience in LA, and I see the neglect that happens when you have politicians who do not have the best interests of black people in mind. I don't care what they say. When I walked by a vacant lot and I had a gentleman tell me, who lived in the neighborhood, tell me that that lot has been burnt out from the Watts riots, that would not be tolerated in any other neighborhood. You can't keep, not saying you, but you can't keep screaming racism when the people who you entrust to create opportunities fail at their jobs.
But racial profiling, stop and frisk laws, I mean, you as a black man just walking down the street, let's say in New York City, you get stopped and frisked simply because you're a black man walking down the streets in New York City. That doesn't in some way get to you?
Well, I have not had that experience.
But so many African Americans have. You know that.
And I do know that, okay?
So it exists. It's not like we're just making things up.
Sure.
This is a major problem in this country that has been recognized, quite frankly, because I've been racially profiled, and it was recognized by the Dallas Police Department.
Sure, but I mean, the racial profiling doesn't just happen from whites to blacks. I mean, when Jesse Jackson said he walks down the street and he sees a young group of black men coming at him, he will cross the street. So it is recognized that part of the problem is the crime that comes from the black community. And I know I'm going to be, and I've had this happen before, that I'm going to be accused of beating up and disparaging my own. But there is a reality when you drive through the black neighborhoods and you see bars on the windows of the first floors of people's homes. If you have to lock yourself in to keep the people out, what does that say? And we need to have an honest discussion within the black community of whether we are going to continue to tell ourselves what we can't do because of racism, or if we are going to change the way we approach our lives and say, no, these are things we can do. We can't keep excusing black or bad behavior because of our socioeconomic conditions.
You know, Bob, when I think about the mass murders that happen in schools, that it's disproportionately white males doing this. If this were black males bringing guns into schools, knives into schools, shooting up the place, killing students, killing babies, killing teachers, if these were African American men, do you think we wouldn't have a nation in crisis, a nation doing something about gun laws, a nation wanting to change things?
No, of course. I mean, exactly. You hear, every time there's a school shooting, you see Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer calling for gun control.
What's wrong with that?
Nothing. But where are they when there are the daily shootings in Chicago? I never hear them talking about when black kids are being shot. And these are the same Democrats who supposedly are supporting black people. They never say anything. Now, that's something that the people who are watching should think about.
But, and the Al Sharptons, the Reverend Jesse Jacksons, they are saying something about the violence in the black community, and people beyond them. I mean, I just happen to mention those too. But there are grassroots movements that are dealing with the violence.
There's grassroots movements, but at the same time, when white kids are shot up in schools, they try to enforce or impose regulation. That's when they are out actively trying to change laws, because it is serious. When it happens to black kids, it's a shame. We should have dialogues, and we should, you know what I'm saying? There is there's a big difference proportionally when it happens to us than when it happens to them.
I'm going to let you have the last word. Bob Parks with Project 21, thank you so much. We do appreciate your perspective, and you promised me you're going to come back, my friend? All right, thank you. And we'll be right back.